Military officials and experts have warned that the hasty exodus of US and NATO troops from Afghanistan leaves the country on the brink of civil war. With 90% of US troops out, Taliban fighters have already started intensifying offensive to seize more and more territory from the weak Afghan government, and local warlords have started to fight back. America's forever war may end, but can the same be said for the people left behind? To discuss this, we connect with Michael Kugelman, Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, and we also connect with Sajjan GOHEL, International Security Director of the Asia Pacific Foundation and visiting teacher at the London School of Economics. Very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. And well, to go straight into the questions, Dr. Kugelman, you've said that there's already a civil war in Afghanistan, and well, despite the concerns regarding the full withdrawal of US troops from the country making the situation worse, it seems that the Biden administration has been really rushing this process, and it's aiming to vacate the country at an earlier date. So, I mean, what difference does 11 days make? I mean, what do you think really is the reason for this rush?
Well, I mean, President Biden had made very clear that he was very keen to get out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible. And, you know, say what you will about the differences in views between President Biden and his predecessor, President Trump, but they both see eye to eye on this idea that it's better for U.S. interests to remove all troops from Afghanistan sooner rather than later. And President Biden had said in his speech in April announcing the withdrawal, and also in brief remarks the other day, that you know, the U.S. has bigger priorities that lie elsewhere. President Biden believes that the threat of terrorism is much stronger in areas of the Middle East and elsewhere. And he's also indicated that the U.S. needs to spend more time focusing on strategic competition with China. So I think that you know, the acceleration of the withdrawal is essentially a reflection of that view from the administration that it's best to get out sooner rather than later, so that the U.S. can then focus on these other issues that the administration says will demand or should demand more of the administration's time.
And Dr. GOHEL, now US President Joe Biden keeps defending his decision. He said that now, he said last Thursday that the Afghan people must decide their own future, and that he trusts the capacity of the Afghan military, which he believes is better equipped, better trained and more competent in terms of conducting war. But are you convinced with this reason? Do you think the Afghan military are capable of defending themselves and defending their territory when the Taliban has been encroaching more and more on the government's territory since May, when NATO forces started withdrawing?
Well, look, the Afghan National Army is a well-trained force, but they have their own internal challenges when it comes to geography, ethnic composition. They also sometimes don't have the same type of backing and support that say the Taliban get. The Taliban are a very well-trained militia group. They are financed often through very clandestine means, such as through the narcotic sales, human trafficking. They operate on a completely different level. Now, within the Afghan National Security Forces, you've got the special forces, and they are very well trained and they are very well equipped, and they have been stemming the Taliban tide to an extent. There's also what is called the national mobilization, which is civilian militias that have formed in the aftermath of the situation in Afghanistan with the U.S. withdrawal, that have also been repelling the Taliban onslaught. But the problem is that how long can they sustain this? And the other angle to throw in, which is very important, is that the Afghans often complain that the Taliban receives significant support from the Pakistani military, sanctuary, which has been an ongoing complaint for the last 20 years and even prior to 9/11. So when you have a state actor that is accused of supporting the Taliban, that also undermines the ability of the Afghan forces to repel the Taliban onslaught across the country.
And Dr. Kugelman, a Taliban delegation in Russia last week claimed that it now controls around 85% of Afghanistan. What kind of scenario do you think we're going to see after August 31st, when all US troops have gone?
And I think the biggest change that we could see is the very real risk that the Taliban could start to enter cities. You've had this stalemate in place for much of the last decade at least, where the Taliban holds sway in rural areas and is able to enjoy a deep footprint and a lot of control, whereas the Afghan state maintains control of the cities. But the fact that U.S. air power will be removed from the battlefield equation, that the U.S. air power had been what had really been effective in repulsing Taliban advances into cities in recent years. Essentially, U.S. air power had assisted Afghan ground forces in pushing back the Taliban when they've tried to enter cities. As a result, there haven't been many cases of Afghan cities falling to the Taliban. A few exceptions. The city of Kunduz briefly fell to the Taliban twice in recent years, but it's been very brief. But now I think the risk is that you could start to see some provincial capitals receive the Taliban, have the Taliban there, and be in a position to actually seize these areas. Now, as I understand it, an agreement that the U.S. signed with the Taliban in February of 2020 stipulated that the Taliban is not allowed to enter cities and fight there. But if the Taliban decides to go ahead anyway, I think that could be a real game changer, because obviously once you get into cities and you seize territory in cities, that changes the whole complexion of the battlefield environment, so to speak. But, final point, indeed, the Taliban did say that it controls 85% of Afghanistan's territory. I think that's an exaggeration and an overstatement. I think that certainly we're looking at a situation where the Taliban controls about half of Afghanistan's 400 districts. But I think that 85% is a bit high. That's not to say that at some point down the road that could be the accurate figure. But I think it is important to take with some grains of salt that assessment coming from the Taliban. The Taliban oftentimes exaggerates its battlefield achievements. Again, not to say it's not seizing a lot of territory, it is, but I think that figure is a bit off.
Well, for the most part, it's been mostly rural areas that they've been seizing. But as you said, as US air forces leave, it's going to be quite threatening for the cities as well. And well, Dr. GOHEL, now polls show that a majority of Americans back President Biden's decision to withdraw troops. But would you say this is the right decision for the Afghan people? I mean, what kind of country are they leaving behind? And do you think a political peace process will be feasible at this point?
I have never been convinced that a political process between the Taliban and the Ashraf Ghani government would ever work. And that's partly because the Taliban have never really showed any sincerity for it. Now, the Doha Accord that was agreed to last year with the Trump administration, for example, one of the most important things about that was that the Taliban promised that they would not harbor terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. And then subsequent UN reports have revealed that the Taliban were actually discussing with Al-Qaeda ahead of the Doha Accords exactly what their intentions were. So you clearly see the type of mindset of the Taliban. And there have been various efforts to try and have a conference in Turkey, which again, the Taliban have been reneging on or have been delaying. They haven't really shown any desire or commitment. There was huge pressure last year on the Ashraf Ghani government to release thousands of Afghan prisoners under the premise that this would somehow help create conditions for reconciliation. And upon release, a lot of those people joined the Taliban and took up arms against the Ashraf Ghani government. So we've seen the Taliban and their true motivations. And keep in mind that this is an entity that retains very strong ties with Al-Qaeda, not just ideological and strategic, but family ties, because many of the elements of those groups have married into each other's families. The Haqqani network, which is part of the Taliban, its leader, Sajjan Haqqani, who is the deputy of the Taliban, has a very strong relationship with Al-Qaeda itself. So unfortunately, the Taliban cannot be trusted. And what we're also seeing, which is extremely disturbing, is that in some of the rural areas where the Taliban are taking control, both in the south of Afghanistan and in the north, they are now bringing in their medieval tactics of beheading people, of decapitating, of cutting off arms and limbs. And unlike in the 1990s, there is, of course, social media and there's technology. And this is getting filmed and it is getting uploaded. And these horrific images just illustrate the medieval mindset of what the Taliban are about. And the Afghan people, of course, fear for their future because the US has played a very important role in developing democracy, civil society, rule of law, women's rights. The US has imprinted its values on an Afghan generation for 20 years. They don't know what the Taliban rule was like in the 1990s, but they are seeing it now in the rural areas and they are scared.
And Dr. GOHEL, well, now the US has made it clear that it's no longer fighting the war on terror, but would you say it's actually really the end of the story? I mean, former British intelligence officer Sir Alex Younger, he called the withdrawal of the Western allies an enormous mistake, and he warned that it could actually pose a greater terror threat. What would you say to that?
So I would agree with the statement of the former MI6 chief, because look at the fact that Al-Qaeda has quietly been rebuilding. It has been developing its networks. The Al-Qaeda affiliate, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, has basically practically submerged with the Taliban. And a lot of radical extremist groups that are affiliated to Al-Qaeda, as well as new entities that we possibly can't even conceive it right now, are going to reform, and Afghanistan will be used as a base and a center for terrorism recruitment, just like the foreign terrorist fighters traveled to Iraq and Syria in the post-Arab Spring period. We will see a similar situation unfold. History is repeating itself in the most disturbing way possible. And lawless territory, ungoverned spaces are the terrorist's best friend. And the problem here is going to be is that with the West leaving, it's not going to be that easy to go back in, because other countries like Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan have their own vested interests in Afghanistan, and they will be very reluctant for the West to try and have an operational presence. And we also, unfortunately, are going to lose our ability to monitor what's happening on the ground because we lose that intelligence. And the last thing I just mentioned is that if the US had not had a presence in Afghanistan for counterterrorism operations, the Osama bin Laden operation to eliminate the Al-Qaeda leader in Abbottabad, Pakistan would not have been possible.
Dr. Kugelman, how do you see this? I mean, Mr. Biden said that the US is going to reposition its resources and adapt its counterterrorism posture. But can this be achieved without having actual presence in Afghanistan? I mean, at this point, what are its options, and how can the US make sure that Afghanistan doesn't become a hotbed for terrorism again?
It's going to be very difficult to maintain a counterterrorism capacity without boots on the ground, and US officials have admitted that. So there will be a diminishment in that capacity. What the US would like to do and what it is trying to do is talk to some of Afghanistan's neighbors to see if it could work out new agreements to have some US troops housed in those countries so that those countries could be used as launching pads for counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, mainly drones, but also intelligence collection. But there are very strong domestic political factors in all of these countries that are being considered: Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and one or two others. The idea of U.S. troops being based in these countries, even though it's happened before in the past, is a very politically unpopular and even a politically dangerous thing to do. So I think it'll be a long shot for the U.S. to get those basing arrangements. For now, the plan is to use existing U.S. military bases in the Gulf region, in the Arab Gulf region, to use those existing bases to fly drones into Afghanistan to stage counterterrorism operations. But that's pretty far away compared to Pakistan or Uzbekistan, which is right across the border. It takes time to mobilize that air power and bring it over to Afghanistan to launch those strikes. And when you're launching counterterrorism operations, you need to move quickly. You need to be efficient. But it's hard to do that when you don't have a closer presence. So I think it's going to be very difficult. Now, of course, one of the big questions is, who's actually staying in Afghanistan? The official line from the Biden administration is that all security personnel are leaving, but that doesn't mean perhaps that you may not have some special forces or some covert presence that remains in Afghanistan. Of course, it's hard to know for sure, but that's something that can't be ruled out as well. But The bottom line is that it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. to maintain that counterterrorism capacity over the horizon, as the administration likes to say. I do think, though, that we may overstate the present terrorism threat emanating from Afghanistan as it applies to the United States. Al-Qaeda is a shadow of its former self. It's nowhere near as strong as it used to be, at least now. And ISIS, which of course was not there before 9/11, it's resilient, it does horrific things, but it's sort of a renegade in the region just because it's rivals of all the other terror groups, including Al-Qaeda. To be sure, though, with the violence intensifying and the lawless spaces getting to be larger, that will certainly help these groups. So down the road, it could become a bigger threat. But at this point in time, I don't think we should overstate the terrorism threat in Afghanistan as it applies to the outside world beyond Afghanistan.
Well, I'm afraid due to limited time, this as well, we'll have to end the interview, but obviously this is a discussion that needs to go on. And well, that was Michael Kugelman, Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, and Sajjan GOHEL, International Security Director of the Asia Pacific Foundation. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.